In a courtroom built on silence and power, Justice Clarence Thomas fined Jasmine Crockett $500 million dollars and tried to humiliate her. But she struck back with three bombshells: secret finances, a rigged email, and a 47-second recording that exposed everything. The chamber didn't just freeze, it exploded. What happens when the woman they tried to silence becomes the one holding all the truth? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The gavel cracked down like a thunderclap. Three hard slams. No hesitation. Clarence Thomas sat towering above the chamber, his robes stiff, his eyes colder than the marble columns behind him. He didn't pause, didn't breathe. His voice cut through the silence like a knife. Representative Crockett, you have been reckless, arrogant, and disgraceful to this court. Today, you will pay for it. Gas flickered across the room, but Thomas didn't flinch. He leaned in, eyes narrowed, and dropped the bomb. You are hereby fined $500 million dollars. The gallery froze. One reporter stopped mid-keystroke. A woman in the back covered her mouth. But Thomas wasn't done. He sneered, then twisted the blade with a smirk that chilled the room. You're not even worth half that, but take it as the cost of your ignorance. Shock rippled like an earthquake. Heads turned. Some shook in disbelief. No one moved. No one spoke. A Supreme Court justice had just weaponized his bench, not to judge, but to humiliate. Cameras weren't allowed in the chamber, but the weight of his words alone felt broadcasted to the world. Jasmine Crockett sat still, eyes forward, absorbing blow after blow in front of the entire nation. And Thomas? He sat higher than law itself, like a god about to watch his verdict crush the mortal beneath him. But Thomas wasn't finished. He was just getting warmed up. He leaned forward again, voice louder, crueler, cutting through the chamber like a blade. You're unprofessional, a loudmouth from Texas with zero respect for the law. His words weren't arguments, they were bullets, fired with precision and meant to wound. You walk into this courtroom thinking you're a warrior? You're a disgrace in heels, nothing more. The weight of his tone didn't just echo, it crushed, and he wanted everyone in the room to see it. Then he went lower, harsher, more personal. You're not a lawyer, you're a politician playing dress-up. Don't ever confuse the two. Every syllable was meant to strip her dignity down to the bone. Even seasoned attorneys in the gallery looked away. The silence was so tight, even the walls seemed to hold their breath. Only one sound remained, the slow, cold tapping of a reporter's pen. It didn't feel like a hearing anymore. It felt like a public execution. Jasmine didn't flinch. Not once. She stared straight ahead, face unreadable, calm like a storm just before it breaks. But under the table, her fingers clenched the pen until her knuckles whitened. She didn't blink, she didn't speak, but her silence screamed. And in that moment, everyone could feel it. She was down, cornered, and crushed in front of the nation. This was humiliation served raw, and Thomas made sure there was no escape. The air was still thick with the echo of Thomas's insults when Jasmine finally rose. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't dramatic, it was controlled. Like a fighter standing up after taking 3 rounds of heavy blows, not to retreat, but to remind the room she was still breathing. Her heels tapped softly against the floor as she stood tall, spine straight, eyes locked on the man who tried to shatter her. She didn't look left or right, didn't blink, didn't tremble. Her voice when it came was cold steel wrapped in calm. Are you finished humiliating me? Or are you ready to face the truth? The room snapped. Gas burst like sparks. Someone in the back dropped a pen. A court officer glanced at another, unsure if they'd just witnessed contempt or history. No one expected her to fight back. Not here, not now, and not like this. But Jasmine didn't wait for permission. She reached into her case with the same grace one might reach for a scalpel. She pulled out a single sheet of paper, no thicker than a whisper, but it carried the weight of a wrecking ball. She stepped forward, calm and deliberate, and handed the paper to the court clerk. Her voice followed, soft but sharp as a blade. This is a financial comparison report. Every number has been verified, tracked, and time-stamped. 3 out of the 4 companies that pushed for this fine have direct financial ties to Justice Thomas. It was like the temperature in the room suddenly dropped. The clerk paused halfway through turning, eyes stuck on the paper like it might catch fire. Around the chamber, assistants leaned forward. Reporters stopped typing. This wasn't a guess. It wasn't a theory. It was clear, organized evidence. Names, dates, amounts of money, all printed, signed, and directly connected to Thomas. The report told a story, step by step. One company, Bastion Holdings, had given a large donation to a political lobbying group just 3 weeks before. That group officially asked the court to punish Jasmine. In that same time period, official records showed that a private investment account linked to Thomas bought shares in a foreign company owned by Bastion. Another company, Elbridge Corporation, had fully paid for Thomas to attend a luxury judicial retreat at a 5-star resort where no cameras or records were allowed. A third company, Harwin Global, had quietly placed Thomas's cousin on its board of directors without ever announcing it publicly. Later, that same company sent over $1 million to a front group that released attack ads trying to block Jasmine's ethics reform bill in Congress. It wasn't an accusation. It was math. Brutal, clinical, undeniable. Thomas leaned back in his seat, but the move felt less like confidence and more like someone bracing for impact. He forced a bitter laugh, eyes narrowing as his fingers began tapping the wood of the bench faster than before. Fabrications. Desperate lies from a desperate woman. His voice had dropped an octave. The smirk was there, but the fire wasn't. He wasn't dismissing the numbers. He was hoping to outtalk them. But Jasmine's gaze didn't shift. Her reply came sharp and immediate, slicing through his dismissal like glass through silence. It's not lies, it's numbers. And numbers don't bend for your arrogance. That hit didn't need a gavel. It didn't need volume. It just needed truth. And the room felt it. Subtle but seismic. A slow, invisible shift. Eyes began turning away from the bench. Postures straightened. Phones came back up. Reporters re-engaged. The energy no longer flowed from the bench downward. It was circling around her now. But Thomas didn't take it quietly. He snapped like a rope pulled too tight. He slammed the gavel down again and again, not for order, but out of rage. His voice rose, shaking with fury, echoing off the chamber walls like a warning shot. You don't belong in this courtroom. You're a parasite feeding off attention. I should have the guards drag you out right now. Each word was spit with venom, less like a judge and more like a man losing control of the room he once owned. His face flushed, and the hand gripping the gavel trembled, not from fear, but from ego cornered by exposure. He didn't stop there. He doubled down, as if volume could erase facts. This court belongs to those who understand the law, not to populist loudmouths who twist it for applause. The insult wasn't just aimed at Jasmine, it was aimed at everyone who dared to listen. It was a last-ditch effort to shame her, to shame the moment, to scare the truth back into the shadows. But the courtroom didn't move. It just watched, tense, frozen, bracing. Then came the final blow, the one meant to erase everything she had just placed on record. You think a folder full of scribbles is going to save you? I've ruled this bench for 30 years. His voice cracked slightly, not with weakness, but with the strain of someone watching their grip slip. He clung to legacy like it was a weapon, hoping fear of his tenure could still silence truth. But even the walls didn't echo that line the way they used to. Across the room, people looked down. Aides dropped their eyes. Reporters stared at their screens without typing. No one wanted to meet his gaze, not out of respect, but out of discomfort, because they all felt it. Something had shifted. The robe still held power, but the man inside it was unraveling, and Jasmine hadn't even moved. And just when the air couldn't get any tighter, Jasmine struck again, this time with fire. She didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. While Thomas was still seething behind the bench, she reached back into her folder and pulled out the second document. It wasn't bulky, it wasn't flashy, just a clean stack of internal emails, stamped, signed, and leaked. Jasmine stepped forward and handed them over, her voice calm, deliberate, and sharp enough to slice the room in half. These are internal communications. They show that a memo recommending sanctions against me was drafted before this hearing even began. She held up a printed copy, her finger tracing a sentence as she spoke. And this memo uses almost the exact same language as your ruling, word for word. A beat passed, a second. Then it hit the room like a detonation. Gasps broke out. Chairs scraped. Reporters jolted upright. Cameras already in motion. The gallery went from breathless to chaos in seconds. Some turned to each other in disbelief. Others stood, phones shaking in their hands. It wasn't just shocking, it was treasonous. The unspoken question spread like smoke. Had the judge written the verdict or just signed off on someone else's script? And Jasmine, she didn't blink. She looked straight at Thomas, her tone flat but fearless. So tell us, Judge, did you write this ruling yourself, or was it handed to you by the corporations you had dinner with 3 months ago? That line cracked through the room like a whip. It wasn't a question. It was a direct hit, and it landed hard. Thomas froze. For the first time, the color drained from his face. His lips parted like he had a reply, but nothing came. Not logic, not law, only instinct. He leaned forward, stammered, then barked the only shield he had left. It's been edited. That's manipulation. You're twisting this. But the words didn't carry weight. They didn't land. They sounded like excuses gasping for air in a room now full of evidence. And every soul in that chamber knew they had just witnessed a fracture in the bench itself. The tension in the chamber had already reached its peak, or so everyone thought. But Jasmine hadn't finished. Not yet. What came next wasn't a rebuttal. It wasn't a speech. It was the final blow. And she delivered it with the kind of quiet that made the entire room lean in, as if they knew the next move would end everything. She reached once more into her folder, slower this time. No theatrics, no defiance, just purpose. In her hand was a small audio device, accompanied by a single sheet of paper bearing the golden seal of an independent forensic lab. She turned to the clerk, handed over both, and spoke in a voice that cut cleaner than any blade. This is a 47-second audio recording accompanied by full authentication from an independent forensic lab. The silence that followed was no longer awkward. It was sacred. Every heartbeat in the room seemed to pause. Jasmine let the silence do its job, let it expand until it wrapped itself around every neck in the gallery. Then, without flinching, she finished. The voice on the tape is Justice Clarence Thomas. A soft click echoed as the recording began. What followed was unfiltered, raw, and lethal. The fine is bait. Hit her hard. Make her look greedy. Then watch her cave. That voice wasn't speculative. It wasn't distorted. It was him. Clear, deliberate, calculating. The voice of a man not interpreting law, but orchestrating destruction. There was no legal language, no ambiguity, just intent. Cruel, strategic intent. Gasps didn't even come this time. People didn't move. They couldn't. The air thickened, like the room itself had frozen. One reporter's phone slid from her hand onto the bench, but even that sound felt muffled. No one blinked. No one whispered. Every eye turned to Thomas, not in fear. No, that power was gone. But in disbelief, in betrayal. He stood up so fast his chair scraped hard against the marble floor. His fists clenched at his sides, his voice unhinged, cracking as it hit the air. This is illegal. This is a setup. This is entrapment. He screamed at once, then again, louder. But each word fell like a stone into a dry well. No echo, no power, just noise. His robes didn't hold authority anymore. They looked heavy, burdensome, out of place. Jasmine didn't look at him. She looked through him. Her voice didn't rise, but the ground beneath it did. Power hides behind robes, but truth hides in records. And today, the records speak. She didn't raise her hands. She didn't gesture. She didn't need to. The room wasn't waiting for a performance. It was witnessing collapse. And that's exactly what happened. Not with a scream, not with a fall, but with a stillness more devastating than any outburst. Thomas stood there frozen, stripped not by anyone else's words but by his own. The courtroom, once his fortress, had turned into his reckoning, and everyone saw it. The destruction wasn't loud. It was absolute. He didn't just lose the argument. He lost the bench. And as Jasmine's final words echoed like a verdict in the air, the walls of power began to tremble from within, not with sound but with shame. The bench no longer felt united. Around Thomas, the other justices were no longer his silent fortress. They sat stiffly, exchanging glances that were sharp, brief, and heavy with implication. One judge pressed his lips into a thin line and looked down at his shoes. Another tapped her pen nervously against the desk, avoiding Thomas's eyes like they were radioactive. It wasn't just discomfort, it was distance. The kind people create when they sense collapse and don't want to be caught under the rubble. The weight of the moment grew unbearable, and finally the court clerk stood. Her chair scraped the marble like a blade against stone. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't wait for permission. Her voice came clean, steady, and final, like a gavel slammed by truth itself. The evidence is valid. This hearing cannot proceed under the current sanction. No gasp followed. No arguments came. Just a stunned silence, so thick it wrapped around the chamber like fog. The sentence didn't just disrupt the proceeding, it dismantled it. A ruling carved in stone just minutes ago now cracked wide open, undone not by debate, but by undeniable proof. The silence was not respectful. It was damning. Thomas didn't interrupt, didn't object. He didn't even try. Instead, slowly, with the stiffness of a man dragging a weight only he could feel, he pushed back from the bench. The chair creaked as if it too had grown weary of holding him up. He adjusted his dark jacket, an act that once made him look composed, now looked like he was trying to armor himself from the storm he'd created. He stepped down from the elevated platform not like a man of law, but like someone retreating from the wreckage of his own arrogance. No one stood to acknowledge him. No clerk followed. No aide rushed to gather his papers. He carried nothing. His hands hung useless at his sides like they had forgotten how to wield power. As he moved down the steps of the chamber, the echo of each footstep struck harder than the last. Each one was a confession the world didn't need to hear out loud. It was a moment no one in that room had ever seen and would never forget. A Supreme Court justice once untouchable, now walking out without a single shred of defense. Not a robe, not a gavel, not even a word. He didn't look back. The crowd didn't breathe. And the courtroom didn't need to speak, for the truth had already shouted loud enough. And while inside the courtroom power had just collapsed, outside, history was about to echo. Word of the recording had spread like fire. It didn't travel, it erupted. From court staffers to journalists, from underground blogs to breaking headlines on major networks, the shockwave didn't wait for official statements. By the time the courtroom doors creaked open, the plaza outside was unrecognizable. Barricades had failed to hold back the tide. A sea of people now filled every inch of stone, curb, and stair, Americans from every walk of life, united not by party but by disbelief. They weren't just there to watch. They were there because something ancient in them stirred. The need to witness justice. The heavy wooden doors opened slowly, like the final act of a trial centuries in the making. Jasmine Crockett stepped out, not carried by aides, not shielded by protocol. Alone, centered, grounded, she wore no victory in her expression, just truth. And as her feet met the top step, it began, first as a murmur, then a swell, then a unified storm of raw, human sound. Truth, truth, truth. The chant ripped through the plaza like thunder without lightning. Voices rose from rooftops, echoed through alleyways, and reverberated against the granite pillars of the courthouse itself. It wasn't applause. It wasn't politics. It was release. Years, no generations, of silence breaking into one chant, 3 words, infinite weight. Jasmine stood still, her eyes scanning the crowd not with pride but with purpose. The moment didn't ask for a speech. It asked for clarity, so she gave it. Today was never my story alone. Today is proof that no one stands above the people. Her words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. The world hushed to receive them. Phones dropped. Tears rose. The air thickened with something beyond inspiration, recognition. That line, spoken calmly, felt like the final note in a symphony the nation didn't know it had been writing. Somewhere in the back, a Vietnam veteran saluted. A group of law students wept openly. A young girl on her father's shoulders clutched a hand-drawn sign that simply read, "We heard you." Then the crowd roared, not in chaos, but in conviction. Reporters tried to capture the moment, but no camera could explain what it felt like when a nation's faith in justice flickered back to life. For a brief, blazing moment, this wasn't a court square. It was sacred ground. Jasmine didn't bow. She didn't smile. She stood rooted as if holding up the weight of every truth silenced before today. The people didn't cheer her name. They chanted a principle. The principle that built the Constitution. The principle Thomas had forgotten. Truth! 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 And in that electric storm of sound and humanity, one thing became clear. This wasn't just about a verdict. It was about vindication. But the echo of that crowd didn't end on the courthouse steps. It charged straight into the heart of Congress. Within hours, the U.S. Capitol turned electric. Lawmakers who once stayed silent now moved with purpose. No more speculation, no more waiting. The Oversight Committee acted swiftly, launching a formal investigation under a bold new banner, Judicial Accountability Committee. But on every news crawl, in every whispered hallway conversation, it went by a different name, the Crockett dossier. And that name hit like a freight train. Major news networks scrambled for coverage. Headlines changed by the hour. Anchors who usually masked their emotions couldn't hide the urgency. Unprecedented, historic, explosive, they repeated. Every major paper plastered Jasmine's photo next to the headline. Some called it the biggest ethics crisis in Supreme Court history. Others said it was the day the bench lost its shield. But no one denied it. Something sacred had cracked. Then came the leaks. First, it was the documents. Financial ties never disclosed, deposits never explained. Reports of luxury trips, resort stays, and dinners worth thousands surfaced one after another. Investigative reporters pulled old receipts from wine tastings in Napa, hotel suites in Rome, and a weekend retreat in the Caymans, paid for quietly by friends of the court. Next came the internal memos, never meant for public eyes, marked confidential and do not copy. One of them read chillingly, "Coordinate ruling timing with advisory input. Avoid patterns." And suddenly no one could breathe. Congress escalated. The Judiciary Committee subpoenaed aides and clerks connected to the justices. In one gripping session, a former aide testified, "We were told to record the gifts but not trace them. Just log the value and shut up." Gasps filled the chamber. By morning, multiple corporations saw their stocks tumble after being named in those logs. The financial web was no longer theoretical. It was traceable, and it was damning. Across the country, the reaction was raw. Not just anger, betrayal. Americans who once revered the court as sacred now questioned everything. College law professors rewrote entire lectures. Students protested in silence, standing outside campuses holding blank signs, representing justice that never spoke for them. Editorials demanded resignations. Town halls overflowed. The question on everyone's mind wasn't, "Is this true?" It was, "How long has it been hidden?" And then it spread further. The investigation didn't just stop at Clarence Thomas. It expanded, fast. More justices were named. More connections surfaced. A sealed envelope arrived anonymously at the Capitol. Inside, boarding passes, donation slips, and a single unsigned note. 3 votes were not about law. They were about leverage. Panic crept into chambers once untouchable. The marble walls of the Supreme Court felt thinner than ever. Congress didn't slow down. They held a joint hearing in record time. Jasmine Crockett didn't speak, but her presence loomed in every sentence. One congressman stood up and said, "Let's be clear. This inquiry began because one woman dared to say, 'Enough.'" The gallery was filled to capacity not by media or lobbyists, but by citizens, veterans, teachers, retirees, everyday people who believed in the promise of justice, but were now staring into its betrayal. And still more came out. A ledger from 2016, a conference invite that included private flight instructions, emails between court staff and corporate executives. The trail didn't just lead to conflict of interest, it led to coordination. Lawmakers shook their heads as each page was revealed. The investigation became the largest judicial ethics probe in U.S. history. One reporter on live TV said, "This isn't a crack in the foundation, it's a collapse." Americans felt it. They felt it when they rewatched rulings that now seem tainted. They felt it when they looked at photos of justices posing with donors. They felt it every time a judge's decision aligned too cleanly with a benefactor's portfolio. This wasn't a partisan issue anymore. It was personal. It was about fairness, about faith in something bigger than any one courtroom. And still, Jasmine remained silent. No press tour, no interviews, no victory speeches. Just her, in her office, sifting through more files, working like the storm hadn't even started. Because for her, it hadn't. This wasn't a moment, it was a mission. She had no interest in fame. She had interest in truth. And the truth, now uncovered, wasn't a single bombshell. It was a pattern. And the pattern was devastating. The committee moved to unseal more records. New witnesses were granted legal protection to testify. The FBI quietly opened a parallel track. Public confidence in the judiciary plummeted. State legislatures drafted emergency resolutions demanding reform. Some even called for term limits on justices. Others floated constitutional amendments. And all the while, that same quiet fire kept burning. The fire Jasmine had lit. At one point, a former federal judge, now retired, broke down during a live interview. "I dedicated my whole life to the bench," he said, "but I never imagined this, not from those robes." That interview was replayed millions of times, not because of the tears, but because of the truth behind them. America wasn't just stunned, it was grieving what it once believed was sacred. The Crockett dossier became more than a scandal. It became a turning point, a test, not just of power, but of principle. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't about one gift or one justice. It was about a system that thought it could stay in the shadows forever, and one woman who refused to let it. But the storm Jasmine started didn't leave her glowing in victory. It left her standing in its aftermath, calm, unshaken, and ready for the next fight. While the rest of the country spiraled through headlines, hearings, and heated debates, Jasmine Crockett stood still. Cameras waited, microphones followed, pundits speculated, but she refused to dance in the chaos. When finally asked how it felt to win, she didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply said, "I'm not fighting to win. I'm fighting so the truth doesn't lose." And for the first time in a long time, silence followed. Not out of defiance, but out of respect. The impact of her words echoed far beyond any television screen. It rang through the halls of Congress. It shook committee chambers. It rattled private rooms where power had once gone unchecked. Lawmakers, red and blue alike, could no longer pretend they didn't see the cracks. Lobbyists ducked for cover. Ethics offices scrambled. 1 week later, a new piece of legislation hit the floor. Its title simple but seismic: the Judicial Financial Transparency and Public Accountability Act. But to the people, it had another name: the Crockett Law. The bill passed with bipartisan speed rarely seen in decades. Cameras rolled as the final vote was read. Some stood to clap, others sat in silence, faces pale, eyes uncertain. Jasmine didn't attend the signing. She didn't need to. Her name was already there, etched into history not in ink, but in consequence. What she had done wasn't about ego or headlines. It was about fixing something no one else had the nerve to admit was broken. Across the country, murals appeared on city walls. Jasmine standing alone in front of a black-robed shadow. Protesters carried signs with her, quote, "I'm fighting so the truth doesn't lose." Law schools revised their curriculums. Ethics classes now started with her cross-examination. Young girls in debate clubs practiced her tone. Lawyers rewatched her hearings the way athletes rewatch game film, breaking down every moment she chose strength over spectacle. But inside her office, things were quiet. The curtains were half drawn, papers stacked in uneven piles. A coffee mug sat untouched beside a legal pad scribbled with timelines and footnotes. And there, at the center of it all, was Jasmine Crockett. No staff, no advisors, no celebration. Just her, seated behind her desk, shoulders still, eyes steady. In front of her lay a printed copy of the $500 million judgment. The number was bold. The fine was real. But her focus wasn't on the money. It was on the sentence typed just below it. They tried to silence me with force. I answered with evidence. She didn't blink. The fluorescent light flickered overhead, casting a faint halo over the page. Outside her window, the Capitol dome gleamed, but she wasn't looking at it. She wasn't thinking about the news cycle or the awards or the praise. She was thinking about every person who told her she'd never last, every colleague who smirked when she raised her hand, every man in a suit who whispered, "Careful, you're going too far." And every time she had gone further. Her phone buzzed once, then stopped. She didn't check it. The noise belonged to another world now. Jasmine stared at the document as if it were a person, alive, breathing, still trying to intimidate her even now. But it couldn't. Not anymore. Not after what she'd already survived. She leaned back slowly, eyes still locked on the paper, and exhaled like someone who had just walked through fire and come out holding the blueprint of the building that nearly burned her alive. In that silence, a memory returned, sharp, vivid, and haunting. The exact moment she stood before the committee and dropped the sealed envelope, the ripple it caused, the faces that shifted, the lie that cracked open, and most of all, the roar that followed, not from the committee but from the truth itself, breaking loose after years in chains. She closed her eyes, not to rest, not to retreat, but to remember. She thought of the families who had written her letters, the mothers who said their children now believed justice wasn't just a word, the fathers who called her braver than any courtroom, the students who mailed her hand-drawn scales of justice with her face in the center, and the quiet notes from whistleblowers, signed only with a single letter or no name at all. Every one of them a reminder, this fight was never hers alone, but it had to start somewhere, and it had started with her. Down the hall, staffers spoke in hushed tones. Journalists huddled near elevators. Somewhere in a different wing, the judiciary chairman was drafting new subpoenas. But here in this room, time held still. Jasmine finally reached for a pen, not to sign anything, not to make a statement. She flipped the $500 million fine over and jotted a single word on the back. Unbowed. It wasn't defiance. It was identity. She stood up slowly, her chair creaking behind her. The floor beneath her felt solid again. Not because the system was fixed, but because the fear was gone. She knew there would be more hearings, more backlash, more headlines. But none of that could erase what had already happened. They tried to bury her. She became the root. Outside, a storm had started, rain tapping lightly on the windows, as if nature itself were applauding. Jasmine moved to the file cabinet and opened the drawer marked pending. Dozens of folders inside, each one a case, a story, a name. She picked up the next file without hesitation, because the work hadn't ended. It had only just begun. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.